Hello everyone and welcome back. In this section we will talk about testing in UI5 and we will start with unit testing. Unit tests are focused on small and isolated parts of an application, like a single class or a single function. And we will use QUnit as our unit test framework. But first let's take a look at our initial application. It should be very familiar because it is a slightly changed version of the last section. And make sure to clone it from the GitHub repository and then run npm install in the root directory. And then again at the root we can run npm run watch to start our application. And here we can see our quick filters, our expensive trips pop up, and again we can suspend or edit our users. Now let's go back and set up our testing. And the first thing we need to set up is the UI5 test suite, and we do that by creating two files, one HTML and one JavaScript module, but in our case it will be a TypeScript module. So first let's go to the app folder, and under the web app folder let's create a new test folder which we will hold all of our test related resources. And let's begin with the test suite HTML file. So let's call it test suite.QUnit, missing the dot here, .html, and it will be a very simple HTML file. Let's update the title quickly, say QUnit test suite for the tripping UI5 app. And next we just need to import a script from the UI5 test library, and the source for that will be, first we go one level up because we are inside a subfolder named test, then resources slash sap UI test starter and slash create suite.js. And next data sap dash UI dash test suite equals, and we will call it test resources, which will be this test folder slash then the ID of our app UI5 slash trippin in this case, which you can find in the component ts here or manifest.json here. And then slash test suite dot QUnit. And lastly, let's set our resource roots. Data sap UI resource roots equals, this one will be in object notation, and on the left side we will have test resources again, but using dots instead of slashes, UI5 trippin, and this we will map to our test folder, which is the current directory, so it's just a dot slash. Now let's save this file and also create our TypeScript module, which will be named very similarly test suite.QUnit.ts. And here we will simply export default an object which will hold our test suite configuration. And first we need to give it a name. Let's call it QUnit test suite for the tripping app. And next we need to set some defaults. And the first one being an HTML page, which will load this testing suite and actually run the tests themselves. So we say page and we specify the path, and how we do that is UI5 : / and then it will be under test resources that we mapped /UI5 / trippin, and then the file we will create will be named test with a capital T .QUnit.html, And this page will receive two query parameters automatically. First one will be the test suite. And the next one will be the test. So let's put those in. And this will be called name, the first one being suite. And next we need our loader, which will load the app resources so we can actually test them. And we will specify the path to our resources. And we say UI5/trip-in, so our app resources will be inside one directory up, basically the web app folder. And let's also save this and create our test page, which will again be a simple HTML5. We can get rid of this title and instead import another script. And source will be this time again one level up, resources, SAP UI test starter, and this time it is named run test.js, and data SAP UI. Actually, the other two is the same as the first one we created for the test suite, so let's just copy those over. And then in the body we need to first give this a class, which should be SAP UI body. Then we need two divs in here. First one must have the ID QUnit, and the next one must have the ID QUnit-fixture. Let's save, and now let's go to our package.json file, and we have the test script which just says no tests and fails. So let's replace this, and instead we will open our test suite HTML file. So we can say using the UI5 CLI, UI5 serve-o to open it by default. And then the file is under test/testsuite.qunit.html. Now that's all the setup we need. Now let's create our first dummy unit test. Now since we will create other type of tests here, let's create a new folder under the test folder for our unit tests and name it unit. And under here let's create a new test, first test.qunit.ts. And first we create a QUnit module by saying QUnit.module, and we give it a name. Let's call this one module A, since this will be just a dummy test. And let's write our first test, QUnit.test, and first a short description of the test, sample test. And the next argument will be a callback function, which will receive a function named assert as an argument. And in here we can write our test. Let's declare a variable value equals 1. And now let's assert that this value is strictly equal. And first argument is our variable. Second one, it must be strictly equal to 1. And then again a short description. We expect the value to be 1. That's basically it. Now we have some TypeScript issues here, so let's fix that quickly. Open our TypeScript config file, and under types here let's add QUnit as well. And now we should be good to go, except I have a typo here. U must be uppercase. Now we need to go back to our test suite configuration. And here we need to tell the test suite where to find our tests. So after the defaults, we say tests. And the only test we created is under the unit folder and it's named first test. We don't need the extensions, just delete. And we just need to specify a title for our test or tests. Let's say unit tests for UI5.trippin. Now let's save everything and open another terminal. And since our test script is inside our app folder, let's go into that and we can run npm run test. Looks like something's wrong. Let's quickly check. Oh, it's because of my misspell of source here. Let's also check the other one. Okay, this one is correct. And now we can actually see our test. Let me close the console and we can see number of executed tests 1 and passed 1, failed 0. We can say show all results and click on this. We can see our module and test. We can rerun it and get to this screen and we can see our test description and it is green, so it has passed. Let's quickly change our test to 1 but as a string, and this will fail because we used strict equal. And here we can see the failed result. Expected is 1 as a string, but the result is an integer. Now let's delete our dummy test and create a real test for our formatter here. Under model, formatter TS, for example, we have the user status state. And let's create a test for this one. Since we will be testing the formatter, I will create a new file here named model/formatter.QUnit.ts. And again, we say QUnit.module. And let's name this formatter. And let's write our first test, QUnit.test. And let's start with this function right here. And for that, we have to import our formatter. So import formatter from here. And in the test, as the description, let's say should format user status state correctly. Then we have our callback function with the assert, and we can say assert formatter dot this function, and we will pass in a for active, and we are expecting the return value success. And we also need to import the value state. Let's copy this one over here. And as the description, let's say active state is correct. And of course we need an assertion. Let's use strict equal. And let's duplicate this for the other cases. See, we have suspended, deleted, and the default case. Suspended as and deleted. And default. For default, we can just pass in an empty string. And we have warning, error, and none. So let's copy these. And before we can run our new tests, we have to update our configuration. So let's go to test suite file, and this file no longer exists. But instead of pointing to this file directly, I will create another file like an index file, and I will name it unit tests.QUnit.ts, because later on we will have more test files here, and I want this file to be the central entry point, so to speak. And here all we need to do is import our test files, and we only have one for now, which is under model/formatter. That's it. And now we can just point to this file, unit tests, in our configuration. Now this should work. Let's go back to our test runner. Okay, looks like we have an issue. Let's quickly check. Failed to load formatter.js. Let's see if we imported it correctly. Okay, looks okay to me. Okay, I see that we have an issue with this attribute here. It should be named paths, plural, instead of path. So let's fix that and try again. And we can see all 4 of our tests have passed. Let's check the details, rerun. And here we can see our module formatter and our descriptions. And let's go back to our test file and create another test for this format date function. And this is our test. Here let's say QUnit.test, and let's say should format date correctly. And let's write our test function, assert that strict equal again, and this time we will call formatter.formatDate, and let's pass in an empty string actually, because here if we pass in an empty string we should get back also an empty string. So we are expecting this, and we can say format empty date correctly. And if we check our formatter, we can see that if we have an invalid date as our source, we should get an error. So let's also test that, and for that we can say assert.throws. And here we need a little bit different syntax. We have to call our formatter function like this, formatter.formatDate, and when we pass in an invalid date, let's say 2018 24/24, which obviously doesn't exist, and then we will be expecting a new error which should say, let's check our error message, invalid date this. So let's copy this. We should get this error, and this date should be what we just passed in, so this. And here we can say catches invalid dates. Now let's save and check again. Now we have 6 tests and all of them passed. And here we can see the details as well. Now let's go back and create another test file, a simpler one for our models.ts file. So here let's create models.QUnit.ts, and again QUnit.module. Let's name this models. Then we can say QUnit.test. And there's not much to test here actually, but what we can test is when we create a device model here, for example, we can check that the default binding mode is set correctly as one way. So let's do that. Let's say should use the correct binding modes for device model. Then we have assert. And first we need to create a device model. So const device model equals models which we need to import. Dot create device model. And now we can assert that strict equal. And we want to check the binding mode, so device model dot get default binding mode, and we are expecting this to be equal to, let's also import the binding mode. That's one way. And as for our message, we can say binding mode is correct. And now, since we have a new test file, let's also add it to our unit tests file. Let's duplicate this. It's named models. And if we check again, now we have 7 tests. And we have 3 test modules for our unit tests. One last thing before we close this video I would like to show you is, let's go back to our models test file. So let's say I want a unit test like this, but I want to fill it in later. So if I comment this out, for example, we will get an error because test function is expecting at least one test. And you can actually already see it here. We can use something like this. If we want to write this test later on, we can just say assert that expect 0, just to tell our tester that we are expecting no tests. And then maybe we can say something like to do write the actual test. And now if we check, we don't get any issues, and here you can see no tests were run, but it still passed. And lastly, of course, for all the assert functions or methods that we can use, make sure to check the QUnit website. And if you just click on Get Started, and here you can see all the documentation, and here under assertions, you can see all the methods that you can use. Now that would be it for this video. Thank you all for watching, and see you in the next one.